Good morning, people of
Hello.
LinkedIn. Good morning. Good morning, Sarah.
Hi.
Officially, like the official good morning.
Indeed.
Good morning. If you're joining us on YouTube, good morning. If you're joining us on LinkedIn, good morning. I've got with me the incredible Sarah Stein Lubrano, who is the author of Don't Talk About Politics. Please do say good morning. If you're joining us live, Sarah, whereabouts are you based? You in London? You're in
Yeah, I live in
London?
London. I'm
Yeah.
looking at my tree outside, which has been just trimmed by the council.
Okay. Well, that's good.
Yes, for better and worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least we know the council tax is going to something of benefits.
Yeah.
Um,
Who
and are
knew?
you looking at grey skies, Sarah, or
Yeah.
how's
Yeah.
that?
How about you? Where are you?
Same. I'm in Shropshire, and
Okay.
it's very grey skies. I mean, I will say the one thing that brightened up my morning walk though this morning is there's a really nice blossom tree that's like like one of these really flat blossom trees, and we're literally now in the only time of the year when that blossom tree is full of white blossom. So I feel
Yes,
like
it
I
is
can't I
perfect that
can't
way.
complain.
I
Yeah,
half the time
yeah.
want to tell people never to come to England because of the weather, but then you get the spring.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And I'm gonna forget. Where's home for you? Where's your accent from,
I
Sarah?
grew up outside of Washington, D.C. So
Uh-huh.
this book is very
Nice.
personal because I grew up with people talking about politics constantly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were just saying actually you've literally got you've got the paperback. So just
Yes,
you know,
yes. In fact, I have a giant box
yeah.
of paperbacks, but this computer is resting on them, so we're gonna have to we'll just look at one. One is enough
A
shortly.
stack.
Yeah.
The computer's resting on a stack of
Mhm.
paperbacks. Don't talk about politics. Um I tell you where I found out about your book.
Please.
I was at a networking event. Well, it wasn't a networking, but it was the launch of a report talking about sort of like, post 2020 and whatever. And there was somebody on the panel whose name I cannot remember, but one of her recommendations out to the audience was you must read the
Oh,
book Don't Talk About Politics by Sarah Stein Lubrano. This was in, I want to say this was like maybe August, September.
I'd love to know who
Yeah.
they were. Yeah, I would love to know that.
Yeah, I'll have
Yeah.
to dig it out, definitely. Good morning, Adrian. Joining us from Cornwall.
Hello.
Wet and a little breezy. Oh, it's always wet and breezy in Cornwall, right? When Adrian, I'm really intrigued. When does the good weather start in Cornwall? Because I know, like, people
Does
from
it?
from my well,
No, I'm
people
sure it
from
does.
yeah, I'm guessing a lot of people from London I know head down to Cornwall, and people sort of south of the Midlands head down to Cornwall. People from the very Midlands head out to Wales. That's where we go when it gets hot as well. Um, so just outside Washington DC, where politics, yeah, I can imagine actually sort of probably dominates a lot of agendas. So I'm going to read out your bio, Sarah. There's a little tradition here on
Great.
this show where I actually get either ChatGPT or Claude to read out your bio, to write your bio, depending on how I'm feeling.
Oh, okay, let's see
Um,
how accurate it is, huh?
yeah, exactly. You get to rate it. You get to rate
Okay,
it out of 10. So
great.
today I'm joined by Dr. Sarah Stein Lubrano. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Sarah. A researcher, writer, and learning designer whose work explores politics, psychology, and how people change their minds. Sarah has a doctorate in political theory from Oxford, or a D.Phil, as some people call it, has worked with the School of Life and is currently head of content at AHEAD and strategy director of Future Narratives Lab. She is the author of Don't Talk About Politics, How to Change 21st Century Minds. Welcome, Sarah.
Yeah, not
How
bad.
did ChatGPT do?
They did all right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
here we are living in this age, but yes, it was good.
Yeah. I've literally just finished listening to this week's Diary of a CEO, which is with Karen Howe, who's written this book called The Empire of AI. I don't know whether you've come
Yeah.
across it. Yeah,
How was that?
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, it'll definitely be a book that'll be next on my list. So, so your book, Don't Talk About Politics. I mean, there's so many conversations that have led to you being on my wish list of guests to bring onto the show. But one of them is that I came across a survey. Maybe it was like last year, I think, because I then actually ran a little poll on it, which was, in the workplace, how many people think that it's okay to talk about politics. And it was around 50-50. So there's clearly a lot of people that don't like to talk about politics anyway in the workplace. And then I also know of some organizations where the individuals in particular who have to run staff networks, run employee networks, and I'm particularly thinking about, for example, my LGBTQIA plus colleagues and some of the individuals that run, race equality or faith-based groups. They're often being told within their organizations, don't be political, right? Don't be political. So what is your advice? Or my LinkedIn is potentially dropping. So I'm going to see if I can reconnect that while I'm doing this. Yeah, well, we can do that. But just give your thoughts on, I guess, let's start with the title. Why did you even want to write this book? Yeah.
Okay, so I originally have been working, and I still work part-time, for a place called the School of Life, which has a very big popular YouTube channel and writes about popular therapeutic ideas and less popular therapeutic ideas and emotional intelligence and mental well-being and so on. And then in 2016, Trump won the election in the United States and Brexit happened. And this was extremely unsettling for me, a person who had immigrated to the UK because I'm a German citizen and who is an American. And I went back to get a PhD, a thing I had told myself I wouldn't do, in political theory.
Yeah.
And this book emerged from that, but also from my worries that the world that we are living in, while it is certainly almost always political, is no longer navigable by talking alone. Let's put it that way. So, and in order to understand that a little bit further, I think it's worth saying that we live in what is at least purportedly a liberal democracy, and the ideals behind a liberal democracy are that if you talk about ideas enough, you can get to the right solutions, right? And this is kind of implied in everything from the idea that like journalism is the air democracy breathes, to the way parliament works, to debates, to the op-ed section of the newspaper, to the way even that we learn to write essays in high school and university, or whatever you call them in the part of the country. But, I find it varies. Anyway, but the point is we live in a world where the implication, theoretically, is that if you talk about ideas enough, the right ideas will win, and that's how politics will work.
Yeah.
And so in this book, using tools from my PhD, I wanted to ask, is that true? Like, do people, when they discuss ideas, change their minds? And the answer is no, asterisk. No, to a really surprising degree, first of all.
Yeah.
No, in that if we watch debates on the television about political issues, even if we're on the fence about them, we don't seem to statistically change our minds, which is a different thing than any individual person feeling like they change their mind. But overall, the population does not change its mind, which means these debates are not having an effect on society, essentially. That's wild. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that on the whole, people are not changing their minds when they read stuff on the internet. So this whole model, this whole liberal discourse model just doesn't work. Again, I'm using liberal not in the sense of the liberal Democrats or the left half of the Overton window, but in the big, broad theoretical sense.
Yeah.
So then I wanted to know, what does change people's minds about politics, I mean, surely some things do. And the good news is there are things that change people's minds about politics. That's very important because, to be clear up front, I'm not an apolitical person. I think all kinds of things happened in the last 2 centuries that were really important, like women having rights, Black people having rights. I mean, I could go on and on. However, so at least 2 things seem to change people's politics. That is their political views. One of those is their connections with other people, the way their social relationships are. If those social relationships change, they will change their views over time. Not, by the way, by being in any way sort of hoodwinked or just kind of pulled gravitationally. It's much more complicated and interesting than that. And we can get into that in a minute. And then the other one is their own actions in the world, their own actions. So if they have a new experience, if they try something out, often their political views will shift. And I give a bunch of examples in my book about everything from climate change and small actions people take during climate change, or being in a heavy weather event during climate change. That seems to change people's views. Having an abortion changes someone's views on that, which interestingly, not in the way you might expect. So those things seem to be what changes people's political views. And what that suggests, and this is sort of the rest of the book in a way, is that if we were to live in a democracy, one of the things we might want is a world where we can very regularly try out new ways of living and existing and have new kinds of relationships. And the cool news for people that are thinking about this in the context of the workplace is that in certain respects, the workplace is actually one of the places we can do that. And that, I think, is what probably is most relevant for what you do, but obviously all of this is relevant because we're all human beings. I think.
Yeah. And as when you were sort of like, sort of like explaining, why you wrote the book, etc. I think we've reconnected to LinkedIn, but apologies. Back for taking. I know LinkedIn, LinkedIn, the technology. Dear. Apologies, but we're back. Yeah. So Sarah was just giving like a kind of like a rundown of why, what sort of like motivated and spurred the book, and I want to delve into something that you said, which was really around the ability of debate to change somebody's mind. And I almost like, before we get into whether it can or can't, but I think you may have potentially answered this just in the final part of what you were talking about. It's almost like, why do we need to change people's mind? Do you know what I mean? Almost like, what is the purpose of the discussion? Is it part of, a good democratic sort of civil process? Do you know what I mean? Almost like, why do we even need to be wanting to change people's minds?
I don't really think that you absolutely need to discuss tax policy in the workplace all the time. Maybe you do. That could be interesting. But I mean, I think there are arguments also for not doing that.
Yeah.
However, I will say, I think about politics with in the as I would say, like, zoomed out sense. I've never been that interested in the details of. I have friends who are very interested in, like, who's advising Keir Starmer right now. Let's discuss. I don't care about that. Maybe you should, but I don't. But I am very interested in politics in the big sense, in the sense of, how are we building a society together, and what does it look like? What is just, and what is meaningful equality, and what is the values that are there? And I think there are ways in which that happens, whether or not we think about them as political. And I'm going to give you an example from the book that is I think useful here, which is to say, one of the first studies that really is the focus of something called social contact theory, which, by the way, is not social contract theory, which is a different and, in my opinion, more boring thing. But social contact theory is a group of studies where they looked at what happens if people are treated a certain way with their colleagues. Do they become less prejudiced? The first studies on this were actually done in the U.S. military when it was integrated after World War II. So in the U.S., a still very racist place in some ways, black and white and other groups served differently, and then in their own individual units. And then after World War II, they were integrated, and sociologists wanted to know if this would make especially the white people, but also other groups, less prejudiced. And they discovered that the answer was yes, but only in certain conditions in the workplace. So if, for example, you're in a workplace and the boss is like, everyone's equal, but then you're not treated equally, that doesn't reduce prejudice. Right. If you are in a workplace, but you don't actually spend a lot of time talking to people from another group, that doesn't change that. If you are in a group and you don't get to notice their differences, for example, if you have maybe different religions, but you never get to talk, so you don't know, or it's not spoken of, you won't reduce your prejudice. What you have to do is have an environment where it's explicit that you're equals, you're actually treated as equals, you have time to have very long form conversations about your lives. And also, interestingly, you need to have a shared goal. The military is actually a great example, whether or not you like the military, because they obviously have various shared goals, including mutual safety, right? And those conditions appear to reduce prejudice significantly. And it's really interesting that can happen in the workplace. So what I would say is the number one thing that is important to think about in the workplace is basically, can we replicate social contact theory? Maybe you're not going to go into the workplace and then decide that you actually think a specific policy thing. Maybe not. And honestly, at that point, I'm curious what your job is that you are spending that much time talking about it. But anyway, but if you can at least come into the workplace and discover a way to truly understand the life of another person who's not like yourself in some important way, that's probably the good kind of talking about politics. And it doesn't necessarily look like debating someone over the lunch table, which, as you can tell, I don't like debate very much.
I do like the idea of social contact theory. I heard that mentioned on a radio show recently, and I thought it was quite interesting. But it's interesting, the conditions that I think the show that I was listening to, they didn't talk about the conditions that you've just mentioned, which I think that's quite interesting, and how we could potentially replicate that in the workplace. I want to. So, what are your thoughts on, And I was talking about this yesterday on a panel that I was on. This, in the workplace, we have a lot of, for example, awareness day events and things like that. What are your thoughts around those things? Do you think that, I guess, looking at it through like a social contact theory lens, do they help? Or do they not? And I'm thinking about, your International Women's Day events, which obviously we've just come off the back of, but actually, because International Women's Day, I feel, tends to kind of come potentially with more of a message. But say, for example, being a little bit more controversial, say a Black History Month.
I mean, it shouldn't be controversial to have Black History Month in my view, but yes. I think we could just go back to these conditions and then think about what we're doing, right? So, I first of all, I think most places are doing some fairly superficial stuff, in my experience. I don't know about yours. Maybe there's better stuff to be done, but a lot of the time it's like, there's a poster. I mean, this doesn't, this doesn't affect social contact at all.
Or it's like, have a cupcake, right?
Okay. I mean, well, if I were, about to redesign a workplace for this, I would be thinking about a period of time where people actually have to listen to women talk about their lives as women, or Black people or whatever it is. I would be thinking also about, maybe even a discussion of shared goals. I mean, I also do a lot of trainings for activists and people that are interested in social change. And, I think a lot changes in a group once you feel like you have shared goals. And maybe there is even some kind of intelligent conversation to be had about why those shared goals are helped by having people of a different race or, multiple genders, etc. I think, and in a way, as I know this will seem ridiculous given the title of the book, which is partially tongue-in-cheek, but in a way that is talking about politics, is just talking about a different kind of politics and doing it well. I think the other thing that's worth saying, and this isn't in the book, but it is very present in my life, is I do think people in the UK are worse at this than some other cultures. And I don't think it's, I'm sorry to say, and I don't think it's that Americans are doing great. We're doing horrible at politics right now. So I'm not being like, yay, Americans. But what I would say is I'm doing a lot of research for my next book, which is on social interactions in general and our lack thereof in Western societies and how it's harming our brains and all of this. And look, when you look at the research on this stuff, a lot of the time people avoid social interactions because they're convinced they're going to be awkward and painful and difficult, and they just don't have them, and then it really hurts them. And here's the deal. First of all, a lot of the time it's completely fine. So, for example, I love all these new psychology studies I'm looking at where they ask people to go talk to a stranger. And both the introverts and the extroverts are like, no, I don't want to talk to a stranger. That's the worst thing ever. And then they do. They go talk to a stranger and they actually really like it. Even the introverts, they come away and say, that was actually really great. Now, obviously, a complicated conversation about what is it like being Black in our workplace or whatever is probably less fun than random subway chat. Maybe not, but, it could be. It could be more uncomfortable. But I do think the other thing that's worth saying is like, simply because something is uncomfortable doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a bad outcome.
Absolutely.
And I think there is a big cultural shift that needs to happen in general about that. And I try, and it's not easy, and I don't always like succeed at this myself, but actually there's a lot of joy to be had at the other end of the difficult conversation. Because something new, how interesting. And I guess what I would say is, in my new book, which is more about this problem of people being socially withdrawn, one of the things I emphasize is like, okay, it's better in some ways to think about social interactions as exercise rather than partying, right? So in the sense that like, I don't know about you, I'm supposed to go running every other day. That's my like, I never feel like it. It's never happened. I always am like, oh, and I try to look for excuses, and then I go, and then I feel great. And most research suggests social interactions are the same way. And now to get to this specific thing, which is like somewhat complex conversations in the workplace, I think to a degree we could see them similarly as a thing we're going to do that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable, especially going up that long hill at the end of the run, especially when we suddenly notice in ourselves that like, oh, we feel a bit guilty or weird, or actually we disagree with someone, or that person's really ignorant or whatever. And this is true for everyone, by the way, whatever their position in this is, but it's more true for people that are in some kind of complicated, oppressed or ignored background. But that might be fine. It might be okay that you're all right. That's like part of life, and it's not necessarily bad. And you might discover that it's really uncomfortable then, but then 3 weeks later, when your niece or nephew has an experience, you suddenly know what to say to them. Amazing. That's your gains.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what you said there about, whether Brits in particular are potentially worse at this, especially I think if you're just comparing, say, for example, Brits and the Americans, and you could bring in other,
Sure, we can
sort of other cultures, right, as
into
well,
all
because
nationalities here.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, I've got an as yet unproven theory around the sort of conflict avoidant nature of Brits, especially in the workplace, actually, to
Okay.
the
Tell me your theory.
extent
Yeah.
that to the extent that topics, because we're conflict avoidant, so that means that in the workplace, for example, I had a session on here a few weeks ago about the unwritten rules or the unspoken rules, and a heavy reliance on things that don't get said explicitly, and the difficulty in giving clear feedback and saying, when you're not happy about something, whether it be the standard of somebody's work or something else. And so I think that a kind of conflict avoidant, almost like I say, overly polite, almost like to a fault. Like we're just so polite, right? So we don't like to go into conversations that are likely to result in some sort of either conflict or offending somebody or whatever. I mean, we may well be thinking those things, but I just sort of have this theory that we're less likely to voice them, because I think that's just part of how our culture is, especially workplace culture. I think it's
called
incredibly,
It's called also, it's not just politeness, it's negative politeness. That's what anthropologists say. You guys are the Japanese. And what that means is that the polite thing is to leave someone alone. Because where I come from, the polite thing is to talk to somebody. Even if they're just sitting in the lobby of the place. Like Americans think, oh, someone's sitting in the reception. I had better go chat to them and see if they're okay and ask them where they're from and what company are they from and who are they waiting for? Oh, I know that person. And by the way, did you see that subway? Whatever. Like that's polite for Americans. It's really rude for British people, right? So it's even further than that. It's what is polite?
Yeah, that is so interesting. Good morning, Sylvia.
Hello.
Yeah, they're real people watching.
Yay.
Yeah, so it's absolutely fascinating. I want to talk about the whole thing of being able to change people's minds, because that's something that you talked about, and in the book, you talk about cognitive dissonance. And I often see this, and I feel as though I definitely was in this space of, you just sort of assume you just need the right facts, or you need to sell it in the right way that maybe appeals to that person. So if they're visual, maybe I'm going to use this method of explaining it, and then I'll be able to change their mind, right?
Yeah.
And we also assume, so with that, we assume that somebody thinks differently to us because either they haven't heard what we've heard,
right,
and the right facts, or they've maybe heard it but they just don't understand it. And actually, if we were to just explain it to them differently, they would get it and change their mind. Just explain why that is flawed and why it often doesn't work.
There's so many good reasons. But I mean, so first of all, there's not, as we've already discussed, there's poor evidence that this is possible by just telling people a bunch of new information, and this is the briefest explanation I can give. In general, our political beliefs are formed not just from information, but they are about how we see ourselves in the world, and that means both what we are like as people, and also, the actions that we think are available to us. And so, if someone has a belief like most migrants are lazy or whatever, it's not that they are carefully examined information, although they may have been fed all kinds of interesting disinformation or not. But it's that it's about them. It's actually in many ways about whether they see themselves as hardworking, whether they see themselves as, whatever it is. And that makes it much harder to change your mind, because in a way it's a form of surgery on the self, So one of the things I get into in this book is something called deep canvassing. And it is a lovely and interesting technique that does seem to, on average, change people's minds about difficult political issues. And it has a couple of hallmark things within it that probably are useful in the workplace to some degree. I don't think you could do the whole thing in the workplace necessarily, because it is genuinely intended to change someone's mind about a particular issue. But some of the things are useful. One of them is asking a person where they are from 0 to 10 on the issue, right? And this seems to be helpful because it kind of it loosens it, it's saying like, oh, you might be a 2 or an 8 instead of a 0 or a 10. And then interestingly, the other question is not to ask them like, why aren't you at 10 if you're at 10? But to say, oh, why aren't you at 0? Why are you not 100% in disagreement with me, essentially? And then they're going to hear from their own mouth the reasons they might have some doubts. Because the reality is, as the person who invented this technique put it, that when you hear ideas coming from your own mouth, you're going to believe you. You're going to believe you believe yourself, you know, why would you believe the other person? You believe you. And so you want to create a world where the person can voice their own ambivalence and then hear their own reasons why they might wish to change their mind a little bit. Rather than give them an infinite reel of information about why you believe what you know, and I try to do this a lot more in conversations. And then the other thing is what's called like narrative exchange, where you tell a story about how something has affected your life. And I do want to flag here that this is a lot of work for people that are already having a hard time or feel effectively discriminated against or ignored in the workplace. You are in a workplace and you're like, you know, I'm the only person of color, I'm the only mom, whatever it is, you know, I mean, many different kinds of things going on. But and now I have to also explain what it's like to be me. I hate this. You know, many people are, I don't want to pretend this is like easy labor. This is hard labor, at least for a lot of people, a lot of the time. But those two things do seem to have some persuasive effect on people. And they're very different than giving people debates or arguments, you know, and I think that's worth thinking about in any case.
Yeah, I love that idea of asking somebody where they are on a scale out of 10. You know, how certain are you on that thing on a scale out of 10? Because I also feel that kind of like opens the door also for finding common ground. You know, so where those elements of doubt are, you can potentially say, oh, actually, you know, I'm kind of with you on that as well, or maybe that's where we. You know, that's where we agree. Interesting question here from Adrian. So conflict avoidance here via politeness and a form of courtesy is challenging. UK, Japan. I wonder if it's maybe not exclusive.
It's not exclusive to island cultures. Yeah, I mean, it's not. You can look at sort of, this is a variation, right, throughout the world. But apparently Japan and the UK are particularly, let's say, intensively negatively polite. And the theory that anthropologists had, at least for a while, is that this is because they're both very small islands, you know, and in an island, you better leave people alone. No, I'm not an anthropologist and I don't really have an opinion on why it is, but I do think it's interesting to note, because I think British people, many of them think anything with leaving people alone is polite, but it's not a given. Maybe even most on average cultures in the world think talking to people is more polite. You know, I mean, it just varies a lot, and it's good to kind of question this in ourselves and then. Yeah.
That's really interesting. On my morning walk, I'm used to sort of saying to people, "Good morning."
Yeah, I mean, I'm an American.
Yeah.
So, we know what I do.
But sometimes when I go to like a strange city or something, and maybe you sort of sense, are people of the, of the mindset that they're usually going to do that. One of the things that I want to talk about, linked maybe to sort of like social contact, is this notion of third spaces, which is something that I really, really enjoyed in your book. Like, to the point of I'm almost like looking for it more so like in real life, and in almost like in particular, what is the workplace agreement? So just talk about this thing about the importance of third spaces.
Yes. So these are terms from more or less sociology. And the first space is the home, and the home is private generally. So you can only be there if you belong there, essentially, or invited in. And then, the workplace is the second space, actually. And it's somewhat private, obviously. And also it is hierarchical. And secretly, the home is sometimes hierarchical also, both because 2-year-olds have to go to bed and also because, sadly, we don't live in a non-patriarchal world and so on. And the third space is this sort of space that is relatively non-hierarchical and relatively non-exclusive. Like a pub. You can ban the guy that's really annoying, but basically anyone can go to a pub. Maybe a gym, you might have like coaches that have more rights than the people on the machines, but like not in a deeply hierarchical way, right? Gyms could also be a third space, and often are. Although I suppose they are technically a business. But in any case, the fee for joining is not very high in a lot of third spaces, right? You can have a gym membership still in this cost of living crisis, sort of. You can, go to the pub. Although I would say we are living through a massive crisis of third spaces because of mostly the cost of living crisis and some other variables also. Many people cannot afford to go to the pub, and one closes every day and another doesn't open in its place. It's a decline in the number of pubs, also clubs. Similarly, there's a theory that right now, the reason a lot of people are getting radicalized, mostly towards the far right in the UK and the US in gyms, is because that's one of the few places that even in a cost of living crisis, men especially, will go, right? And so that becomes their third space. And then they essentially end up with relationships that pull them towards that set of beliefs.
Mm.
But in any case, that's a dark version of the third space. For the most part, third spaces are places where we encounter other people as equals, where we essentially encounter the conditions of social contact theory in a non-workplace environment that may be even more important in some ways, because actually the skills for existing in a third space are kind of the skills for existing in democracy, right? Like you basically have to accept that other people are there, that you're going to have to navigate things with them, that they have the same rights as you, and that maybe you have at least a little bit of a shared goal, even if it's that like the pub is nice, right? I even talk about third spaces for children, which are, of course, playgrounds. And one of the examples I give in my book is that, you know, imagine you're a parent and you are worried about your kids and you decide to get them a play set for the backyard. And so you do, and you're really happy with yourself, and the kids now play in the backyard. And that sounds great, except what it means is that your kids are actually not going down the street to the playground down the street. And they're no longer doing the thing where they're navigating like, oh, there's a new kid, but we should be nice to them. Or, you know, we need to take turns on the slide with someone we don't know. Or we need to talk to kids who speak a different language than us. They're actually losing some of the sort of essentially democratic, also life skills that you get from being in a public place with other people. And also, of course, once you don't send your kids to the playground, you stop caring if the council funds it, and then the playground gets shut down, and then the other kids who don't have backyards don't have a playground, and then you're suspicious of all these kids that are making noise outside your house playing in the street, and this causes a constant disinvestment cycle in the infrastructure of democracy, much of which is third spaces. So this is my plug for, you know, publicly owned infrastructure of all kinds, especially third spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I remember in your book, I'm sure you mentioned things like, for example, libraries, or maybe I just made that up because I like reading.
Absolutely. Of course, yes. Libraries are very important, and they're constantly getting defunded, especially lately. And it's one of the most important places to preserve. It's not just that they have books in them, although obviously as an author, I love books. It's that for those who don't know, libraries tend to do an enormous number of other things. They are one of the main places that parents can go with their kids. If it's raining, which I mean, it is in this country basically all the time, you can take your kids there. It's a place that elderly people can go because, to be honest, many people never made that digital transition. And this is one of the only places they know how to navigate. It's a good place for teens to go, especially when there's trouble at home. It's a place where many events happen, many publicly programmed events still happen that are very important. Everything from, the meetings of domestic violence survivors to people learning how to do a new skill. It's often a place outside of the job center where people can go and get help applying for jobs. I mean, they kind of do all the things that you think, oh, someone's surely covering that in our community. It's probably happening in the library. And right now, our libraries especially are under threat in the UK and elsewhere. I was actually very happy that people who read my book went and used it to make a campaign for third spaces in Newham in London. And they actually did save the libraries from a 50% funding cut. But, next year they'll be trying the 50% funding cut again. It's because of the massive crisis in council funding across the UK, in large part through national policy. And I could go on and on and on and rant about this ages and ages. But if you want to read an American version of this problem, you can read about Palaces for the People, which is a book by the sociologist Eric Kleinenberg. And it's basically just a love letter to libraries and public libraries.
Yeah, it's libraries were a big part of my own childhood and growing up, and as like an avid reader. But I loved your take on them as these as these third spaces. I think it's absolutely incredible. I want to go on to social media next, just very briefly, if I may. But I just wanted to just dive into the comments really quickly. Good morning, Emily Foster. Hope you are well. Adrian Arenta. And of course, Japan has Kuki Woyomu, reading the air. I've never heard of that phrase, but I like the sound of it, Emily. That sounds cool. I'm glad you had this conversation. Politics in the workplace is one of my favorite topics. The reality is that we're in a place where organizations are totally overwhelmed, so they are now avoiding any talk, where 5 or 6 years ago we saw them taking a stance on issues like Ukraine or BLM. Now there is a deafening silence on what's happening externally, and yet trauma is real for people. I'm not advocating one way or another, but I think the shift is interesting. Would you agree with that, Sarah? Do you think that there is like more reluctance nowadays, maybe than there was, say, for example,
for sure.
a few years ago? Yeah. What do you think is driving that?
I think it's the national climate in both the US and the UK, right? I mean,
Yeah.
look at Mark Zuckerberg, right? For a while, Mark Zuckerberg's politics were basically, or his stated politics, who knows what was going on internally, were, oh, yes, equality and diversity, and let's do a bunch of DEI. And then he, he's now in a position where he's more or less supporting not only the Trump administration, but also this sense of, that's all wokeism, whatever.
Yeah.
And, and we're kind of going through a backlash against a lot of this stuff driven in large part by sort of far right politics and resentments that have been fueled and created there, as well as, we're living through a massive economic crisis, even if it doesn't seem like it day to day, a huge cost of living crisis, but also something that I think is more rarely discussed is that it's not just that unemployment might be high in some cases, it's also that a lot of people have simply dropped out of the workforce and are no longer looking for work. And the way governments very conveniently measure unemployment is they ask, are you actively looking for work this month? We're actually facing a much higher unemployment crisis than people realize. Not to mention, many people are self-employed. So they wouldn't necessarily say that they're unemployed, even if they are lacking the work they need to support themselves this month. We're just going through a terrible economic time. And when that happens, we tend to see far-right ideas and also just generally resentful ideas be taken on in society because people are scared and they're anxious. And so there's been this kind of swing back from some of the things that happened a couple of years ago, including with Black Lives Matter, to sort of far more fearful and anxious position towards otherness. And with that, I think a fear of talking about politics, especially because it's not modeled by either the administrations or, these tech companies that have effectively become like administrations for us, and that, of course, brings us to your social media point.
Yeah. And I was almost, I guess part of what I was going to say, and it links to the point that you made about Mark Zuckerberg, right? And we know about, it was fascinating to watch I'm going to call it, the kissing of the ring, right? You know what I mean? It was almost like, do you think that part of the reason, we'll definitely get on social, do you think part of the reason that some companies don't want to say what their stance is because it goes against the establishment, or for example, for companies that are, say, headquartered in the US or whatever, it's going against the power base, and so actually there is a fear that actually if they put their stance out, it's just not acceptable nowadays. Do you think they've almost been silenced? Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, I think sometimes that happens. I think people are worried about getting sued, especially in the US, where like everything you can sue for anything in the US. It's nuts.
Yeah,
it's a country of lawyers, they say, and China's a country of engineers. I think the other reality is there's more or less nearly always going to be a significant political divide between the people that own capital and the people that don't. You could find a rare example here or there of a person who has capital and has a different politics, but on the whole, you are talking about a group of people that have a certain kind of power and people who don't. And really, it benefits them in a lot of ways not to say anything, right? Because once you start talking about politics, you're going to get some clever guy in the back of the room who's going to say, hey, but you are earning X million a year and we cannot pay our rent, right? And why should we be paying rent, actually? Couldn't we fucking own a house for once? Sorry to swear. And then you kind of get, so politics, the people that tend to benefit most from politics not being discussed are people who are already benefiting from the system. That doesn't mean that it's definitely going to be constructive for you to solve the Middle East crisis over a major meeting. I'm not saying that. It's not that simple. But what I am saying is, the people in power, of course, they are like quite happy for these conversations not to happen. I would similarly say, do talk about workplace organizing in your workplace. Do that.
Absolutely. Let's talk about social media and the role of social media in helping or hindering constructive discourse around these topics. Your thoughts?
Okay. Yes. Look, I mean, basically, I don't think social media is useful for discourse. I know because I have an Instagram page, especially, that has 37,000 followers, and I watch people argue in the comments all day, and it is not helping anyone, and no one is being helped. But there are reasons for that.
When you said that social media is not useful, I was just going to say you could just put a full stop there.
No, period. Like, let's get off of it. No, I mean, look, here's the deal. It's in a weird way, we can just reverse engineer the example from what we discussed earlier, which is most of the time, social media doesn't fulfill a lot of the criteria anyway that are in social contact theory, right? People are kind of positioned as equals, but like maybe not really. They're not also explicitly named as equals. A lot of their differences are not visible, and they're not likely to become visible because the way that people are interacting is quite superficial and fleeting. So maybe you'll know someone's race, but you might not know anything else about them. It's not very humanizing in this way, essentially, or that's the word we're often using for this anyway. Also, importantly, there are no shared goals. If I have to work with you every day in a department and get something complicated and stressful done, even if I'm deeply prejudiced against you at first, social contact theory suggests that over time, when you and I do something together, it's almost like I am slowly, reluctantly exposed to the fact that we need each other, that we actually do better when we work together, that you are a brilliant, intelligent person, and so on, you know? And social media, none of that opportunity exists. So, I mean, you know, we could go on and on about the ways it's making it worse, but I suspect everyone listening has a sense. But I wanted to outline that there's a reason that it pretty much can't do the things we wish it could do, you know?
Yeah. Do you think, is it changing? I don't know whether this is something you've looked into, but obviously, you know, it came up on the Diary of CEO this week around the social media use for Gen Z, but particularly Gen Alpha now as well. And when I think about it, so I've got a nephew who is, how old? 19, hates AI. Like with a passion, like will not go, but you know, but they're an artist, right? Absolutely, just fundamentally out of principle, cannot stand anything to do with AI. Is not a big fan of social media at all. Do you know, I don't know what the stats are, but do you think it's changing? Like, are younger generations shunning social media? Is social media just full of boomers?
No, I mean, Facebook is full of boomers for sure. I mean, look, here's the thing. Something I get into towards the end of the book is, as much as it's important to know what people believe that they believe, if we were to kind of pick up the word belief and examine it, it can mean a lot of different things. And the reality is that most of us have a set of kind of embedded beliefs that we cannot shake. And I don't just mean this in terms of like racial prejudice, although it's obviously true in many ways. I actually mean this in a more basic sense, which is like, I personally, for example, think that, you know, I don't know anyone pretty as a woman, and I don't have to be pretty. But of course, every day I'm going to get up and look in the mirror and be like, I can see my, you know, that's because I live in a society where that belief is so omnipresent. Similarly, another set of contradictions that are more relevant here is that most of us are doing things all the time that are not really in line with our beliefs. And that triggers cognitive dissonance, which is a thing I talk about a lot in my book. But even though Gen Z will often say that they don't like social media, which makes sense because they experience it so much firsthand, and it is terrible. They are still using it, you know, and of course they are, because that is the number one form of entertainment really in the world right now. It actually surpassed normal television this year for the first time. More people watch short form videos on the internet this past year, 2025, than watch TV every day. So it's the number one form of, you know, news dissemination and entertainment in the world. Especially for young people. I think the fact that someone doesn't like something is almost unrelated to whether they're going to consume it, actually, when things are that big and that present. So I think they have a justified skepticism of it, but I don't know whether we're really making progress. And in a way, that's because also we don't own this stuff, right? I mean, I think always to bring it back, you know, people love to be like, is this good? Is this bad? Look, it's probably bad, but the reality is it doesn't matter in a way. We could debate it till the cows come home. We don't own it. You know, a couple of billionaires own almost all of the world's major communication platforms. And because of the nature of platforms, which is essentially that they are a monopoly, we have no choice. You know, even more banal things. Here you and I are on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft. And let's be honest, because Microsoft is this like big, powerful platform, I'm not even saying it's doing bad political things, though it does. I'm actually saying the software is shit. Right? Have you tried to put a video? I mean, you have to do it all the time. Like, it's much worse video software, but it doesn't matter because there's no other alternative to LinkedIn. Right? You cannot find a job or you know, announce that you are delighted to blah 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 in B2B marketing unless you're on LinkedIn.
You can't announce that you're honored and humbled in the same,
indeed.
time.
Where else would we be honored and humbled? And so LinkedIn can do whatever it wants, which is largely to make all of your videos grainy and horrible, it seems. You know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, don't even get me started. You really. I mean, we're gonna wrap things up soon, but I want to. You've given us some really good tips. So for work, and I know, you know, you talked in particular about how important it is to remember, especially, you know, for the sort of people that are running staff networks or employee networks, and they often are in these minoritized groups that we don't want to give them additional work. But what advice, I guess, would you give to those individuals in workplaces generally about navigating these conversations, and even maybe that pushback, so when they get that message from somebody in comms or HR that says, oh, we're being too political, or don't do that, how do they kind of respond to that when at the end of the day their community are saying, this latest anti-immigration march, or this latest anti-trans ruling, etc., is having this impact on my life? Do you know what I mean? I feel like they're stuck in this very difficult position.
It is tricky. I guess what I would say is, okay, so let's assume that you are a person who does want to talk about this a bit with your colleagues anyway, or in some way bring it up. I think going back to this deep canvassing technique, what's interesting is what seems to work about it is partially that the stories are from your own life. And like when I do facilitation for group stuff, I tend to say it's better to share from a place of a scar rather than a wound. So you might want to think about which stories you feel comfortable sharing, what you don't, what level of information and so on. But the number one thing that I think is possible to say is like, this is my life. Like I'm not here to recruit people to a cult. This is my life. Perhaps I am worried about, as a parent, that my kid is going to get shot by the police. That's my life. Maybe I have trans friends and I'm worried about my friends. And the thing, of course, and there are more and less polite British ways to say this, but people who are on the other side of the coin in many of these equations talk about their lives all the time. I mean, I was in the workplace, a very kind of traditional-ish workplace, 9-to-5 sort of office thing. And all I heard about was, let's be honest, I pretty much exclusively heard about white people having nice monogamous relationships, getting married and having babies over and over and over and over again. And I don't mind, by the way. Like I'm pro people having all their babies. It's great. But like that's their life, right? Imagine if I had shown up in the workplace and been like, oh man, I'm just tired of hearing about these white monogamous people with their babies. Will they just shut up already about their baby? And so I guess I would say is like, look, I'm being a bit ridiculous, obviously, but the same point holds true for anything else. We politicize the other doing their personal life, right? And if I showed up and was like, I'm queer, I'm this, I'm whatever, like that's actually my life. That's my life, And so I think it's worth just sort of gently being like, oh, I didn't know that I can't bring up my life. This is my life.
It's not politics. It's my life. Like literally, do you know what I mean?
Or it's both actually, but let them work that out for themselves maybe a little bit sometimes. And, and then I think the other thing in general, look, this is not in my book, and it can go the wrong way if you don't quite master the tone, but sometimes the best thing is actually just ask questions. Not even necessarily in like a snarky way. It's just, it lets the person work things out for themselves. You might say, oh, okay, can you explain to me, like, I want to understand, what do you think is a good way for me to talk about my life? How should I, you're kind of having them work through the problem. And I find, asking people questions is a good verbal form of self-defense in almost every scenario. And it gives you time to think as well. Like,
I like that. So definitely hopefully we've sort of left people with a few practical things. For anybody that's listening today, apart from going out and buying your book, which
Please
I would highly recommend, and as I was saying before,
and actually I have this thing which I'll say. So I have a campaign for my book, and my campaign for my book is buy my book for someone you hate. Right? Not for someone you like, although if you do that too, that's great. But like, if you a really difficult boss, be like, I got you this book. And it says that you can't say it. Just get it for your boss.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, get it for the people at work that are telling you that you can't talk about politics.
I'm like, you love
it. You love it. As I was saying before we started, I actually listened to the audiobook. Because that's how I consume a lot of my nonfiction, which was narrated by Sarah Stein Lubrano. So I had, how long was the audiobook? Was it about 7 hours, I want to say?
Yeah, 7 hours,
So I had like 7 hours of Sarah in my ears on my morning walk.
Sorry about that. I'll be showing up in your dreams now, I suppose.
which was an absolute treat. So for people that are listening, where can people connect? Where do you hang out most online?
I am
LinkedIn, Instagram, or
wildly enough most popular on Instagram. But I also have a Substack, which if you're more that kind of consumer and you just want to read something thoughtful every 2 months, I'll post something thoughtful every 2 months. I'm on Blue Sky. Yeah, I'm on TikTok for the kids.
Great.
So any of those places is great. And I'm on LinkedIn. You can be my friend on LinkedIn and we can complain about why LinkedIn is a bad platform.
Yeah, we could be LinkedIn.
Because it is. It's terrible.
And I love that you're on Substack. I've literally just recently gone onto Substack as well. It's the place. It's the place.
It's great. It's much more thoughtful.
Yeah. If apart from getting your book, if there was one thing you wish that people would do differently to have better conversations about politics, what would it be?
Oh, I think it's this, which is to say, there's still a myth in our society, not only that we're going to fix everything by talking, but that thinking is a thing we do on our own. That thinking is a thing that we go alone into our room by ourselves and we think for ourselves and we do our own research. And one of the arguments I make in this book with a lot more data and evidence is that that's not where people change their minds. And that's not what thinking is. Thinking is a thing we do together while acting on the world. So what I would really encourage you to do is rather than think abstractly about politics here, pick something you care about and go actually do a political activity with other people and talk to them. And then you will actually have thought about politics. And that's what I think people should do.
Yeah, I love it. More doing. That was one of the things I took away from the book, actually. More doing and less talking. More doing, more getting to know people, more organizing, all of that stuff. Absolutely love it. Sarah Stein Lubrano, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for those of you in the comments that hung on. I know Microsoft and LinkedIn unfortunately let us down with the technology, but we did reconnect.
Yes. so nice to have so many people listen.
Yeah, so if there was anybody that missed out on the conversation in the first few minutes, you can always check out the replay. And if you are watching this on the replay, thank you so much for taking 50 minutes out of your day to join us. And I will see you. I won't see you next week because it's Good Friday, but I'm going to see you the week after that. So I hope everyone has a really amazing weekend. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. This was wonderful.